Once upon a time, in the kingdom of Persia, there was a grand celebration called the Feast of the New Year. It was the most important celebration in the kingdom. The king spent the whole day in the city of Skyres, enjoying the wonderful shows and activities his people had prepared for the festival. As the sun began to set, the king was about to tell his court to go to bed when suddenly, an Indian man appeared before him. He had a horse with fancy decorations that looked just like a real one. "Your Majesty," the man said while bowing, "I'm sorry I came so late, but I have something amazing to show you. None of the things you saw today can compare to this horse. Please take a look at it." The king looked at the horse and said, "I see it, but it seems like a well-made imitation of a real horse. Any skilled craftsman could make something like this." The Indian replied, "Your Majesty, what makes this horse truly special is not how it looks, but what it can do. If I ride this horse and wish to be in a particular place, even if it's very far away, I'll get there in just a few moments. That's why this horse is incredible. If you allow me, I can prove it to you." The king of Persia was curious about anything unusual and had never seen a horse with such abilities. He asked the Indian to get on the horse and demonstrate what it could do. In no time, the man was on the horse's back, and he asked the king where he'd like him to go. "Do you see that big mountain?" the king asked, pointing to a tall mountain about 3 miles away from Skyres. "Go there and bring me a palm leaf from its base." Without delay, the Indian turned a knob located near the horse's saddle, and the horse leaped into the air as fast as lightning, disappearing from sight. In just 15 minutes, the Indian returned, holding a palm leaf. He guided his horse to the king's throne, dismounted, and placed the leaf in front of the king. The king was so impressed by the horse's incredible speed that he wished to own it for himself. He was sure the Indian would be willing to sell it, so he already thought of it as his own. "I had no idea how valuable this horse was just by looking at it," the king said to the Indian. "I'm thankful to you for showing me its extraordinary abilities. If you're willing to sell it, please tell me your price." The Indian replied, "Your Majesty, I always believed that a wise and skilled king like you would appreciate the true value of my horse once you knew what it could do. I even thought you might want to have it. As much as I treasure it, I'm willing to give it to you on one condition. I didn't create this horse, the inventor gave it to me in exchange for my only daughter. She made me swear never to part with it unless I received something equally valuable in return." The king interrupted, saying, "Name anything you desire. My kingdom is vast, with many beautiful cities. You can choose any city you like and become its ruler for the rest of your life." The Indian responded, "Your Majesty, I'm grateful for your generous offer, but please don't be upset with me when I say that I can only give you my horse if I can marry your daughter, the princess." The courtiers laughed when they heard this, and Prince Firoz Shah, the next in line for the throne, was furious at the Indian's audacity. The king, however, thought it wouldn't be a big sacrifice to give away his daughter in exchange for such a fantastic horse. While he was pondering his response, the prince spoke up. "Your Majesty," he said, "there can be no doubt about how you should respond to such an arrogant proposal. Consider your own honor and the legacy of our ancestors." "My son," the king replied, "you speak with honor, but you may not understand the true worth of the horse. If I refuse the Indian's offer, he may make the same deal with another king, and the thought of someone else owning this seventh wonder of the world would be unbearable. I'm not saying I will accept his conditions, and maybe he can be persuaded, but I want you to inspect the horse with the owner's permission and test its abilities." The Indian, who had overheard the king's words, thought he detected a willingness to consider his proposal. So, he happily agreed to the king's request and came forward to help the prince get on the horse and show him how to operate it. But before he could finish, the young man turned a knob, and he vanished from sight. They waited for a while, hoping the prince would return, but as time passed, the Indian grew worried. He knelt before the king and said, "Your Majesty, you must have noticed that the prince was too hasty and didn't allow me to explain how to return to the starting point. I beg you not to punish me for something that wasn't my fault and not to blame me for any misfortune that may happen." The king was scared and angry, and he asked the Indian, "Why didn't you call the prince back when you saw him disappear?" The Indian replied, "Your Majesty, the prince moved so fast that I couldn't speak in time. But we can hope that he'll realize and turn another knob, which will bring the horse back to the ground." The king worried and said, "But what if the horse descends into the sea or crashes into rocks when he comes back?" The Indian reassured the king, "Don't worry, Your Highness. The horse can travel overseas and take the rider wherever they want to go." The king, however, was not entirely convinced and said, "Your life will be in danger if the prince doesn't return safely to me in 3 months or send news of his safety." Then, he ordered his guards to arrest the Indian and put him in prison. Meanwhile, Prince Fira's Shah kept ascending into the sky, going higher for an hour until the mountains looked like plains. He thought it was time to come down but couldn't figure out how to reverse the horse's flight. He realized that he forgot to ask how to return to the ground. He carefully examined the horse's neck and found a tiny peg near its right ear. He turned it and slowly descended back to earth. It was dark, and the prince couldn't see anything. He had to let the horse guide him. It was past midnight when he finally touched the ground, feeling tired and hungry because he hadn't eaten since early morning. After dismounting, the prince tried to figure out where he was. In the darkness, he found himself on the rooftop of a massive palace with a marble railing. There was a small door in one corner of the terrace, leading to a staircase that descended into the palace. Some people might have been cautious, but not Prince Fira's Shah. He thought, "I'm not causing any harm, and whoever owns this place won't harm me when they see I'm not armed." Carefully, he descended the staircase. On a landing, he noticed an open door, leading to a dimly lit hall. Before entering, he stopped and listened. All he heard was the sound of men snoring. In the faint light from a hanging lantern, he saw a row of guards, each with a sword beside them. He realized that the hall must lead to a queen or princess's room. The prince stood still, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. He noticed a bright light behind a curtain in one corner. Quietly, he moved toward it, pulled aside the curtain, and entered a magnificent chamber. Inside, there were sleeping women on low couches, except for one who was on a sofa. He knew this must be the princess. Carefully, he approached her bed and saw that she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. But he knew he was in a dangerous situation, as one cry of surprise would wake the guards and mean his certain death. So, he knelt quietly and gently tugged the princess's sleeve, drawing her arm closer. The princess opened her eyes and was astonished to see a handsome, well-dressed man before her. Seizing this opportunity, the prince knelt and spoke, "Madam, I am a prince in need, the son of the king of Persia. Due to a very strange adventure that you may find hard to believe, I find myself here seeking your protection. Just yesterday, I was in my father's palace celebrating our most important festival. Today, I'm in a foreign land, in danger." The princess, the eldest daughter of the king of Bengal, listened kindly to his plea and replied, "Prince, don't worry. In Bengal, we practice hospitality and kindness, just like in Persia. You have my word for your safety." Just as the prince was about to express his gratitude, she quickly added, "I'm curious to know how you traveled here so quickly, but I can see that you must be hungry. I'll have my servants take you to one of my rooms where you can have dinner and rest." The princess's attendants were now awake and listening to their conversation. Upon a gesture from their mistress, they quickly got dressed and grabbed some of the candles that lit the room. They escorted the prince to a large, tall room where two of them prepared his bed, while the others went to the kitchen and returned with various dishes. Then, they showed him closets filled with clothes and linen before leaving the room. While they were gone, the Princess of Bengal, who had been quite taken with the prince's beauty, couldn't fall asleep again. She was wide awake, and when her attendants returned to the room, she eagerly asked if the prince had everything he needed and what they thought of him. They replied, "Madam, we can't say how he has affected you, but we believe you'd be fortunate if your father allowed you to marry such a pleasant young man. There's no one at the court of Bengal who can compare to him." The princess was pleased by their compliments, but she didn't want to reveal her feelings. She simply said, "You talk a lot. Go back to bed, and let me sleep." The next morning, when she got dressed, her maids noticed something unusual. Unlike her usual routine, the princess was very particular about her appearance. She insisted on her hair being styled multiple times. She thought to herself, "If the prince found me attractive when he saw me in my disheveled state, he will be even more impressed when he sees me at my best." She adorned her hair with the largest and most dazzling diamonds she could find. She wore a necklace, bracelets, and a belt, all adorned with precious stones. Her ladies put on her a robe made of the finest fabric in all of the Indies, a garment only worn by members of the royal family. When she was dressed as she wished, she sent a message to check if the Prince of Persia was awake and ready to see her. She wanted to present herself to him. When the princess's messenger entered his room, Prince Firoz Shah was about to leave and ask if he could pay his respects to the princess. But upon hearing the princess's request, he immediately agreed. "Her wish is my command," he said. "I'm here to follow her orders." In a little while, the princess came to see the prince in a private room. She explained that she couldn't meet him in her own rooms due to the eunuch who could come at any time. She was eager to hear his story. So, the prince began telling her about the Persian festival and the enchanted horse. He explained how the Indian man asked for his sister's hand in marriage to give the horse to the king. The king agreed, and the prince rode the horse, ending up in the princess's palace. He sneaked in and found her. He thanked her for her kindness and admitted that he fell in love with her at first sight. She blushed, making her even more beautiful. The princess was happy that fate brought him to her home. She welcomed him warmly and assured him he was free to stay in her palace. As they were about to discuss it further, they were interrupted for dinner. They enjoyed a lovely meal with sweet music. Later, they moved to a room with a beautiful view of a garden, and the prince praised the palace's beauty. The princess hoped that introducing the prince to her father would lead to their marriage. But he hesitated, feeling he needed a proper entourage to meet the king. The princess offered her help, but he was unsure. The prince was grateful for the princess's kindness, but knew he must return to his worried father. He promised to come back to marry her with his father's approval. The princess asked for a few more days together, and he agreed. They enjoyed 2 months filled with fun activities. The prince insisted it was time to leave, but assured her of his love. He wished she could come with him to Persia. The princess was pleased to join him, but worried about the enchanted horse's control. The prince assured her, and together they sneaked away early the next morning on the magical horse. The prince and the princess flew back to Persia on the enchanted horse. The prince wanted to land at a country house near the city rather than in the main square. He informed his father about their return and the princess, and they prepared for a grand reception. The people in the city were overjoyed to see the prince again, and he told his father about the Indian and the love of the Princess of Bengal. The Sultan agreed to their marriage and ordered a celebration. The Sultan released the Indian from prison and sent him away. The Indian learned about the princess and planned revenge by pretending to take her to the palace on the enchanted horse. The princess agreed, thinking he came from the prince. The Indian succeeded in tricking the princess into mounting the enchanted horse, and they took off just as Prince Firoz Shah was leaving the palace to go to the country house. The Sultan and the entire court followed the prince. The sight of the princess being carried away left the prince filled with grief and remorse. He decided not to follow the Sultan into the palace, but continued on his way. The prince realized that the doorkeeper was not at fault and, instead, he himself was to blame for the princess's abduction. He asked the doorkeeper to get him a dervish's robe, but to keep it a secret that it was for him. The prince left the country house in the disguise of a dervish, taking a box of pearls and diamonds meant as a gift for the princess. He had no clear destination but was determined not to return without her. The Indian steered the horse toward the kingdom of Kashmir and, after some hours, landed in a wooded area near the capital. Hungry and suspecting the princess was also famished, the Indian left her by a stream and brought back food. The princess, weak from hunger and unable to escape, ate and, after regaining some strength, bravely confronted the Indian's threats. She called for help, and her cries were heard by a troop of horsemen led by the Sultan of Kashmir. They approached to inquire what was happening. The Indian claimed the princess was his wife, while the princess vehemently denied it and told the Sultan who she really was. The Sultan, convinced by her beauty and noble bearing, ordered the Indian to be beheaded on the spot. The princess thought she was saved, but the Sultan took her to his palace and had her put in a beautiful room with servants. He promised to hear her story the next day and ordered her to rest. The next morning, the Sultan proclaimed his intention to marry the princess, and she soon realized she was in grave danger. She fainted upon hearing the news. The princess, pretending to be mad, was taken to the palace of the Sultan of Kashmir. Her condition worsened, and the Sultan decided to call in all the doctors from his court to diagnose her. They were all unable to understand her condition. The princess acted so mad that they couldn't touch her. The Sultan then summoned doctors from the city and even called on foreign professors, but none could help the princess. She acted so convincingly that nobody realized she was faking her madness. Meanwhile, Prince Firoz Shah heard about the mad princess of Kashmir during his travels and decided to go to Kashmir to try to rescue her. He obtained a doctor's robe and presented himself at the palace as a physician with a remedy no one had ever tried. The Sultan granted him an audience, hoping he could cure the princess. The prince was taken to a room where he could observe the princess without being seen. He watched her sing a sad song, which made him realize her madness was a fake act to protect her from marrying the Sultan. The prince returned to the Sultan and informed him that he believed the princess was not truly mad and that he needed to speak with her privately to help her. The Sultan of Kashmir tried to find a cure for the Princess of Bengal's feigned madness, but was unsuccessful. The prince disguised himself as a physician and gained access to the princess. He told her of his plan to help her escape, and she agreed to cooperate. The Sultan was pleased to see her improving and granted the prince permission to continue the treatment. The prince suggested a public spectacle in which the princess would be cured, and the Sultan agreed. They prepared to present the spectacle to the people. The enchanted horse, placed in the palace square, was surrounded by guards and nobles. The princess mounted the horse, and the physician performed a ritual with incense and murmured words. As the horse took off into the sky, the physician shouted for all to hear, telling the Sultan to gain consent from princesses before trying to marry them. The princess and the prince safely flew to Persia, where they married. The king of Persia and the king of Bengal approved of the union between the two countries.